This is ASP.NET Core MVC, Development to Delivery. My name is Jeff Fritz. I'm a program manager on the ASP.NET team. I'm primarily responsible for things like web forms, WCF, and a couple of the other frameworks that you know. But I am also involved in community. I do a lot of blogging on the MSDN blogs. That's my email address, and that's where you can find me on Twitter. I encourage you to send me tweets if you have questions out there at any time. I'm more than happy to respond to them. We are live streaming. There's a camera. Hello out there, internet people. And if you're watching the recording, hello, future people. Drop me a line. Let me know who wins the World Series. I'm in Vegas. I got to place a bet here, man. OK. So moving on. We're going to talk about MVC, but we're going to talk about MVC stuff that's actually stuff that we can use that's UI-centric. And if you saw my last session, I was like jamming in content at the end. Well, I'm going to put more into this session. We're going to code all this stuff live for you, OK? We're going to talk about the startup class. Everything that goes on in there, we're going to dig into it and really take a look at what those things do. Secrets. It's not like, something that we didn't tell anybody else. We're actually going to talk about some of the secrets you need to manage in your application and what you should be doing with those things. More about routing. There's cool things you can do with routing in MVC. I want to make sure that you know what they are and how you can use them to your advantage. Dependency injection, right? That's one of those design principles that are really cool for us to use. It's now in the box with ASP.NET Core. I want to show you how you can take advantage of that. Razor views. Lots of new updates for Razor that I want you to see with C#6, asynchronous interactions in your views. There's a view imports file that we're going to take a look at also. We have new UI metaphors called view components and tag helpers. These are interesting new ways that we can build pieces of HTML markup that we can embed into our Razor views and make it easier for us to develop. I can't give a talk about MVC without talking about Web API, because we've merged MVC and Web API now. So we've got to take a look at some of the things we can do with Web API. We'll tiptoe around Docker. I know there's a couple other Docker talks here at the event. We'll show you how easy it is to get started putting your application into Docker with ASP.NET Core. And at the very end, we'll deploy everything out to Azure App Service. So I'm going to show this slide again. If you saw my other session, you're familiar with this slide. This is where you can get ASP.NET. There's where you can find the docs, our source code, because everything's open source. Guys, you don't need to take a screenshot because I've got video for you. You can put your cameras down. It's OK. Our community stand-up is live ASP.NET every Tuesday. Starting next Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, we'll be talking about the cool things that we've done and accomplished in ASP.NET there. Our blog is at blogsmsdn.microsoft.com/webdev. And we just released preview 1 of ASP.NET Core 1.1 on Monday. That's where you can find, if you just go to that same WebDev blog, it's, I think, the second item down right now, is the announcement. It shows you all the cool new features that we're introducing. All right, I'm dumping out of the slides. Let's get into demos. Let's actually start writing and working with an application here, because that's where it's interesting. We're developers. We write code. So let's do it. So Visual Studio Community 2015 is what I'm using, because this is the free version that you can use if you're a hobbyist, if you want to do some work at home. There are limitations, though, depending on your business size. You can go online on visualstudio.com, and it will tell you the licensing restrictions around that. But for the most part, if you're using it at home, it's free for you to use, or for an open source project, too. And there we go. So let's start a new project. I'll go File, New Project. And I'm going to start a .NET Core version of an ASP.NET Core application. This is Web Application 89. Let's create a full web application here, because we're going to be talking about MVC. This one has MVC all configured with Razor views so that I can go through and start building things, building great user interfaces and interactions with my users. And I wanted security in that. That's not the template that I wanted. Let's try that again. This is going to be 90. So I'm going to change authentication and turn on individual user accounts. So this is going to allocate some security information, some account capabilities, security account capabilities, and configure Entity Framework core for me so that I can work with a database. So I want to start off taking a look at Startup CS. So you can see some of the things that are going on here. Let's talk about what exactly is happening inside this class file, because this is where everything starts as far as configuring my ASP.NET application. So let's clean up our indent there a little bit, and so first thing, we have a constructor that receives something called an iHosting environment. This is a variable that has all the information about the environment that you're hosting your application in. So not only will it tell us stuff about IIS, but it'll also tell us stuff about, if you're hosting an IIS, that is, but it'll also tell you some stuff around the development environment or staging environment that you're running in, right? You give your environments a name, like development, staging, or production. You can get that information out of there, kind of like how we're doing right here. If we're in development mode, we're going to take these steps. If we're in a different environment, we're not going to execute those things. We've also got a thing here where we're building our configuration from files that are sitting in the root of my project, right? So this content root path is actually the root folder of my application. It's going to look in there and try and find an app settings JSON, which I do have. But it's also going to look for an app settings dot whatever my environment name is .json. So when you deploy to your staging or production environment, you could have a app settings .staging.json or an app settings .production.json that has just that configuration that you need in that environment, right? There might be some alternate features you want to light up, put it in that file, and you can read and hit that configuration directly. I'm going to come back to this one in a minute. We add environment variables, okay? So you load things into your environment variables when you're in production, perhaps, so that you actually want to have secrets and things that only the production folks know about configuring your application that you as a developer don't need to know, and you have saved into a settings file here that you can work with directly. Your operations team that manages your production servers can set environment variables and tune the way your application behaves because you've allowed them to send environment variables with configuration into your application. So my configuration is built here and lobbed into this configuration object. So we don't have configuration manager by default here in our application. You can still bring that in if you're running on full framework, but it's not available on .NET Core. The old configuration manager doesn't know how to read from web config in this instance. The next method, the next important method that we have here is configure services. Now, configure services is where we're going to set up and we're going to configure all the things that the runtime is going to use, particularly around dependency injection. That's what you'll see in here is configuration of adding the capability for a database context, a entity framework context that can be referenced and loaded into my controllers, in this case, for setting up my, my application users, my security. And the next piece here is configuring identity capabilities. This is my security authentication services. So it's going to use an entity framework store called application DB context and configure default token providers for that. So all my security is defined right there. Add MVC so that we know how to handle controllers. And then we have this add transient stuff down here for an email sender and for an SMS sender. This add transient statement is one of the 3 ways that I want you to know that are the easiest ways to load your dependency injection container configuration, okay? Dependency injection container, we know what that is, right? Who doesn't know what that is? I'm gonna go over it anyway. Dependency injection container is an object that sits in memory, kind of an in-memory service that has a mapping of objects. It knows about all the objects in your application. But in particular, it has mappings of interfaces to concrete types so that we can say, I want an iEmail sender, and it knows how to create and manage the lifetime of, in this case, an auth message sender. There's 3 different scopes to it, and that's where these add statements come from that I want you to know about. The first is transient. A transient scope inside your dependency injection container says that every time I request an email sender, a new one's going to be created and sent to me. The second one I want you to know about is singleton. So there's a services add singleton method, right? Add singleton. That is an object that's created once and only once for the entire duration of your application's lifetime, okay? When your application stops, it's then destroyed. But you have one instance of it for the whole time your application is running. And the final one, and the one that's a little bit tricky, is scoped. Scoped says this object is going to be created once per request that I'm managing. So when that first request comes in and says, I need a database context, perhaps, create it, and then it isn't destroyed until that request has completed. When the request has completed, it's destroyed, and then a new one's created for the next request. So this way, you can be sure each time you request a database context throughout your application, throughout your request, you'll get the same instance. And I'm getting a weird echo. That's kind of neat. Okay, so those are the three different types of scoping that you can have when you build your dependency injection container and configure it. The last method here is the configure method. Oh, and each one of these methods that you see here, configure services and configure, these are being called by the dependency injection container, and these objects are being passed in, instances of them, concrete instances, without me having to say, give me a new iApplication builder. It's being maintained and managed by the framework behind the scenes for me, and the dependency injection container just makes it available to you. So this configure method is the method that it's run once, and it sets up the pipeline, the HTTP pipeline for your application. Top to bottom, this is executed. So if something's handled at the top of it, it can be overridden and changed somewhere further down in the pipeline. So for example, I have a developer exception page. If an error happens, the developer exception page may catch it first before the database error page. So if there's no developer exception, but there's a database error, it'll fall through to the database error page, and that may handle it and stop processing at that point. Static files is way down here, right? We need to tell ASP.NET Core how to handle those GIFs, JPEGs, PNGs. Yes, I called it a GIF. It's either a GIF or a GIF. This time I'm calling it a GIF. I'll go back to calling it a GIF some other day. So we have to tell ASP.NET how to handle static files. And then last, here we're telling it that we are using those identity configuration items, but last we're telling it that we are using an MVC endpoint here, and this is the default router configuration, right? And this should seem pretty familiar to those of you who have done MVC in the past, right? Controller / action / some ID value, right? That's a pretty standard router configuration, and that's why we've called it default. Now, let's go back, and I want to talk about secrets. Now, we have that way up here, this guy right here. See this? Add user secrets. There is in project.json, where'd it go? There it is. There's Microsoft Extensions, configuration user secrets, and down here in the tools, let's collapse these. I've also got Microsoft Extensions Secret Manager tools. See it there? Secrets, right? This isn't something that's, black hat, James Bond type thing, spies are going to come out of the ceiling. No. This is, we're trying to help you by preventing checking in things like a connection string that has a password embedded into it, checking that into GitHub, right? Or your favorite source control provider, Visual Studio Online, right? You don't want to check those passwords in, okay? If you check one of those things in, a password in, somebody can find it. You can go on to GitHub, you can go on to Google, and you can search for password and find people's passwords on GitHub. That's a problem, right? Okay, so how do we get around that? What the secret manager is a way for us to put that configuration, things like your database connection string or your Facebook keys, right? Your private and public tokens, put those somewhere else for development so that you're working with them and you can't possibly check them in. So what we've done is we've broken it into two pieces. There's a secret manager, and then there's also, where'd it go? I lost it. And there's also a configuration user secrets here. The secret manager lets you write things into a hidden file that's sitting out there on disk. And actually, if we right-click on our project, there is Manage User Secrets. If I click that, I get this secrets.json file. And it's actually not that secret. You can see I've got a tooltip that shows me exactly where it's located, and it hid from me because it's a secret. It is under app data roaming, Microsoft user secrets, blah, 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 blah. Well, check this out. If I want to go to that location, all right, so this is under user profile, right? And where was it? So it was under roaming Microsoft. Where am I going here? Yeah, I want app data, you're right. There we go. Roaming Microsoft, and then user secrets. And then here's all these folders out here. This one is ASP.NET-Web Application 90. And there it is. And secrets.json. It's just a file sitting here on disk. It's a JSON file sitting on disk that it knows where to go and find it, that's hiding, that I can load up and use. And it's just a JSON file, so I can put into it the same things and the same structure that I have over here in app settings JSON. Now, app settings JSON, the configuration that it gave me by default here is okay because I have a trusted connection equals true in this. So it's using my authentication to connect in. But if I had user ID and password in here, I don't want to commit this file with those contents to GitHub or Visual Studio Online. I want to put this connection string somewhere else. So I can copy that over here to secrets.json. And now it will be found and usable by my application. Now, that's nice. There's this secret manager, though, that's sitting on disk that I can reference and use. So if I go into Web Application 90, oops. Okay, let's do a .NET restore. And I'll be able to execute .NET space user-secrets and manage the contents of that file. Okay, so I can actually do a list and see the contents of that. So if you don't have Visual Studio, you don't have this tooling in the user interface, you can do it on the command line here and still interact and set values there that you want to hide if you don't want to go and find that JSON file on disk. Now that JSON file, it's not encrypted. It's living somewhere out there that we can find and remap to, but it may change in the future, it may not. If it does, the tools will update appropriately to manage it. So that's a little bit about managing secrets in your application like passwords. Now, that GUID that was at the end of it comes from right here. Whatever that secret ID is the name of the folder that it's going to go look for. All right? So take your passwords for your databases, for your online services, put them in a secrets file, and I don't want to see them on GitHub. All right? I'm going to find you if you put them on GitHub. And I give the guy who works across the aisle from you, Skippy, I give him permission to come over and smack you if he finds it on GitHub too. All right? So, user secrets. Let's talk a little bit about routing and route mappings that we can work with. So, let me build this just to show you that it does still work. And then we'll get into routing and some of the route mapping stuff. So I'll let it go with IIS Express. Routing's been enhanced. There's a couple of cool new features in routing that we should know about, we should take a look at. Here it comes. So IIS is booting up, and there's the application, web application 90, okay? So it's running, and it's still loading in things from my user secrets file. All right, routing. Routing, we saw, is configured over here in Startup. It's way down here at the bottom, and we've got routes map route. And that's a great default configuration. That's something nice that I can put my hands around, and okay, you know what? It does its thing there. But what if I want to have some overrides? Something simple that goes somewhere else. Maybe I want to optimize some things for the search engine. You know, if I want to tune and add some other things, I can certainly put other configuration items in here, routes, map, route. I can even do areas. We still have areas available for you, right? And I could put a name on this, SEO for Jeff, right? And I can say template, and I can have it go to Jeff. And then the defaults, we say defaults. And this is a new object, right? So now I'm going to say controller equals home, right? Action equals, let's say, about. Done. So now I've got a route for SEO. If you browse to /Jeff, I'm going to go to the About page. So if I restart that, this will take just a second. And when I mouse over About, it actually navigates to /Jeff. And if you look at the About, if you look at the link for About, it created a, right? Routing does that two-way binding, so it creates the /Jeff navigation point. So I can do those things, but I don't have to set up all my mappings here inside the startup class. For example, we can actually put attributes on our methods and move these things around. So let me get rid of this. And I can go back over to that actual controller, right? So I had a home controller. So there's no attributes on this, right? This is a garden variety controller, right? It inherits from MVC controller, and it does these things that we kind of expect, right? I'm returning views. There's Razor out there that it's going to interpret and parse and do its thing. I can put, there we go, now we can see it. I can put an attribute on these and say route, and then here I am, I can specify the template for it right here. So let's have this one, we'll change it and call it Vegas. I can give it a name at that point. We don't need to do that, but I'll just put that template there. I will build and restart. I didn't click it hard enough. And now, there it goes. So when I mouse over the About, you see it goes to /Vegas. So I've moved that configuration. And this is something that people like because it helps to keep all of your configuration appropriate for that controller with the controller. You don't have to go look in 3 or 4 different places to see everything that's needed in order to configure and actually access this method. It's all right here. So that's one thing that you can do. You can also do things like put constraints on your routes. So I can do something where maybe there's an ID that I need to receive here, right? And I can say ID question mark that says, this is optional, right? Optionally, I might have an ID that's here that we're going to pass in. Let me actually receive that, okay? So that ID is going to be received and passed into my method, but I can put a constraint on it that says, this must be an int, right? Because if it's a string, it's going to break coming into my about method, because if I pass the word TWO to, it's not going to work. It doesn't know how to turn that into an integer. But by putting this constraint on it, it'll actually fail that route validation and move on to the next route in the mapping. okay? It'll look at the next one, try to match that, and if it doesn't find anything, it'll just fail. So that's a little bit about routing and how we've done some things to change that. We've also added, gosh, I need to mention we have templates in here as well. We can also do something like, gosh, we can say controller here. And what this template inside the square brackets does is it says, whatever the name of the controller is, that's what I'm going to listen to on the route. And the name of the controller is that text before the word controller in the name of this class. So this will answer on just home. Make sense? And you'll see that a little bit when we get into Web API. That kind of thing is configured right there for you. So I'm going to remove that, remove this, clean that up. Okay. I talked a little bit about IOC. Let's go over and take a look at views and see how views have been updated, okay? So it's nice that we can do these things with the controller and behind the scenes. We're returning views here. Let's look at a view. So let's go over here. I'm going to go into Views, Home, and let's take a look. I'll start on About. All right, so this is pretty standard. You know, I've got a block of C# content up top. I've got some C# inline content here, right? We use the @ symbol to change context from .NET to HTML. And when it's done with its .NET code, it just automatically changes back. Really, you don't have to learn anything to learn Razor syntax, because as soon as you start an @ sign, you're in .NET code. And as soon as you finish typing .NET code, it flips back to HTML. And you can see that clearly here, where the period at the end of this view data is not being interpreted. It's not highlighted in gray, so that it demonstrates that that's .NET code. But what I can do in here is I can get involved, and Razors support C#6 syntax. So I can do things like string interpolation, right? I can do things like today is, right? And I can go datetime.now.today. No. There we go. To string. Okay? And it will properly format that and put it now into the title and the top of my page. That's right, I changed that, right? I removed that, so now it's over here. There you go, okay? So it's doing string interpolation. All the other C#6 features are there, okay? String interpolation, I think, is really important to know that you can do inside of your views, because I think this is the most common thing you're going to do. When you get into more advanced features of C# and you start doing more things besides if and for or switch case, you might be doing a little bit too much work inside of your view. Which actually leads me to the next thing that I want to talk about. We can now have our views function asynchronously, right? And that's one of these things where I start to think, we might be getting a little bit too far out there. But you can have these function asynchronously. So if I change this so that there is no layout, and I have to do that because the layout calls this synchronously. So if I want to do something asynchronously here, I can actually do an @await. Excuse me. Where is it? Flush async. Okay? So what this line does when you say @await flush async says, whatever has been processed from, in this case, line 10 and above, send that to the browser right now. Because I may have something that's happening on the next lines, something like task delay 3000. Right? Await. There we go. And then on the next line, H3 after the delay. That's all in Razor, so I should be able to just refresh. I stop the service. Here it comes. So there, and it paused, and then 3 seconds, and then after the delay triggered, okay? So it's asynchronously running. It's sending stuff as quickly as possible when I say flush, and I have my asynchronous task delay happening, okay? So if you're returning things from a database and it's an I queryable still on the page, you can go through and iterate over it asynchronously and send things back to the browser as they're being developed, okay, as they're being parsed. So that's some of the things that you can do inside of Razor. And really, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's other things that we've started doing with Razor that we should take a look at. So for example, there's this view imports thing over here that we should see. Now, we don't have web config managing our application configuration anymore. And previously, we had this web config that lived in our views folder that showed us all the namespaces that we had available for our Razor views, that showed us some of the other configuration that we wanted to do. There was even an HTTP handler in there that prevented navigation to those CS/HTML files directly. Well, we don't have web config parsing and running in our applications anymore, so we've added this thing called view imports CS/HTML. And this is a list of statements that will be added to the top of every Razor page that you start interacting with from a controller. So by default, it's given us some using statements here to make namespace interactions very easy inside of my page. So if you have other libraries that you're bringing in, throw a using statement here. If it's something that's a business object that you know you're going to be using again and again and again, throw another using statement in here to help support that. The interesting part that's in here is this last one, add tag helper, okay? The add tag helper statement lights up this new user interface functionality called tag helpers, where we've got code that runs in C# and inserts markup into your page. A good example of this in the default templates is over here in the layout page. So if I go to shared layout, and you see some of these that light up in purple, these are tag helpers. An environment is a simple, easy one to learn right off the bat, okay? Environment is not an HTML5 tag. It's not an Angular directive. It's something that we're going to parse and manage server side. So the environment tag, everything from here to here is being managed by C#. So the way that this tag functions, it sees the environment tag, and it looks at this names attribute. And if that names attribute, you can even see the tooltip. If one of the environment names inside there matches the name that we're currently running on, so development, that's the environment we're always running on when we're in Visual Studio by default, the content here inside of the tag will be sent to the browser. That's pretty easy. That makes sense. Consequently, then we've also got one here that says environment names staging, production. So if it's production or staging, these links will be emitted. But these links are in purple too. But link is an HTML tag, right? This is different because these now have these ASP-fallback href. Let me bring some of these other ones over so we can see them. There we go. So what this is doing is saying, here's the location on the ASP.NET CDN that you can go to get this style sheet. And that's going to be processed and handled appropriately. But these other attributes, ASP fallback, it's going to check to see if it can find that CSS class. And if it can't, or it can't find this property and this value of position and absolute, if it can't find that, then it's going to emit markup to say, load the local copy of the CSS file instead of the one off of the CDN because you didn't get a response from the CDN, right? Either this person doesn't have access to the CDN that's browsing to my site, or the CDN is down. And that's an even bigger problem that you shouldn't have to deal with. So you have that fallback capability so that you continue to use your style sheets. So the tag helper is lit up because of the presence of these attributes. So now we have tag helpers that light up because of a special tag name and because of an attribute. So you have two options if you want to make these for how you can build them and test to determine how to output content. Further down here, the next one that I want you to see, and this is kind of one of the ones that's important that kind of triggered the idea of tag helpers for us. This is the anchor tag helper, right? And anchor because it's an A tag, right? And you can't call it an A tag helper because if you create a class called A tag helper, that's kind of, well, of course it's a tag helper. Which tag helper is it? You get confused at that point. So it's the anchor tag helper, right? Because that's the full name of what an A tag is. And before, we used to build, right? We had HTML helpers that we would use. We would say things like HTML action link, right? And we would have link text that says home, and the action name is index, and we had to submit our route values, whatever that is, right? And then we would have, what's the next one? Where is it? There's one for my CSS. I know it's here somewhere. Link text action name, oh, the controller name, my bad. So the controller name is home, and then now I can specify HTML attributes that I want to output. So I would do, if I wanted a CSS class on this, I would say new class equals, warning or whatever, right? Oh, but class is a C# reserved word. Okay, well, I'm in C# mode here, so I escape that by putting an at in front of it. That is the ugliest way to just generate an ahref and put some content around it. I'll go you one further. If you wanted to put an Angular notation on it, you want to do data ng, link, right? Not link, no, it's not linked list, it's link. Right, and do something that way? Well, right? This messes up because it doesn't know what to do with the hyphens. So we've got a little bit of a problem here. It's a not very manageable capability with this action link syntax, and that's why we decided to do tag helpers. So instead of doing that, and also, did you notice when I was working with the class, I'm in a magic string over here. There's no validation on that. There's no check to say, oh yeah, that's what this does. I don't even know if warning is a good class to put in here. I just said, oh, let's put that in there, right? Let's get rid of that. I can actually add CSS classes and still get, there is warning, there you go. But I've got full IntelliSense over all of my CSS classes here, right? This is something you expect from Visual Studio, and I've got the little B icon here that says, this came from your Bootstrap configuration file, right? This is a Bootstrap class that you can use. But there are other things hanging out here where they're not with these Bs. Right? Look at these. We have these glyph icons, right? If you're using a glyph icon from Font Awesome or from a couple other font libraries, we've got capabilities here to show you exactly what's going to appear inside of this. And you can't do this using that old action link syntax. So tag helpers gives us the ability to continue to light up the features of Visual Studio that you probably want to use. There we go. Right, check this out. There, see the blue square? That's a custom one that came out of one of your CSS files. The Bs are all Bootstrap. So, and I can also do, right, I can do that data ng. Come here. There we go. Href, that's what it is. See, I couldn't even figure out what it was. It's data ng href, right? And I've got all that IntelliSense for Angular 1 built in that I can't touch. So that's why we think you should try tag helpers. Now, They're referenced here. There's a couple of them down here. The script, this functions the exact same way as those links. So you can use your script tags here and do very much the same thing. But let's take a look at writing a tag helper here real quick and what's involved in that. So I'm going to come over to Solution Explorer. I'm going to create another folder. And we'll call this Tag Helpers, because I like to keep my web projects neat and tidy. And let's add a new item. Now, if I go under .NET Core, there actually is a tag helper template. So let's call this the repeat tag helper. So I have a class that inherits from tag helper, and it's decorated with this target element attribute. That target element attribute says, this is that element name, environment, that will parse and use for this tag helper, okay? I had, right, it was A, and it was the anchor tag helper, right? So it's actually called in the source code anchor tag helper, but in the target element, it says A. So I'm just gonna name this repeat. Now, this is actually an optional attribute. You don't have to use this target element attribute because by convention, whatever is before the word tag helper is the name of the tag. That's kind of handy, that's convenient, but I like to be a little bit explicit about some of these types of configuration things, because if my class name changes, I want my tags to continue working. So I like to put it there in the target element, and that's strictly a neatnik thing for me, all right? You can define other, so we were talking about how attributes lit up some of these, so I can also add HTML target element, and I don't have to specify a tag, I can actually specify an attribute, right? And I can say, you know, I can put in here count, okay? So if there's a count attribute, this will light up. Now, if you put properties into this, so let's create a property called count. Whatever the properties are, those are attributes that it will parse and use from my tag. So let's save this. I'm going to build, and I'm going to go back to my about page. So I wrote some of this other stuff in here. I'm just going to remove this just because I want to jump right through and show a little bit about how this works. So I'm going to work down here. I want to be able to say repeat, you know, and I'm going to say the Cubs win the World Series. Okay? So I want whatever's in there to repeat. This isn't lighting up in purple. It's because it's not in my view imports file yet. I need to specifically say add tag helper for those things in order for it to actually light up. So it's star, comma, and then the name of the assembly. So in this case, it's web application 90. Come on. And all of a sudden, my machine is slowed down. So I'm going to come back over here, save this, and it turns purple, right? It knows some C# is going to fire on this thing and do something with that. So I actually want to put a count on this. Look, it knows what a count is. I can actually reach back into that tag helper, and if I put some text here, the number of times to repeat, and if I delete that, right? It didn't bring over my syntax yet. Still building there, it finished the build. You will get descriptive code there. I'm not sure why it's not showing me my count. So let's put it 3 times to make Harry Carey happy. And I actually want to have it do that repeat. So how do we do that? Let me go back to the tag helper. I have two things that are passed into this process method. I have the context. This is everything from the start of the start tag to the end of the end tag, and the output. What are you actually going to write out? So what I'm going to do to make this very, very easy is I'm going to say for each, not even for each, for var I equals 0, I less than count, I plus plus, you can guess, output dot content dot write, append HTML, that's it. And I'm going to append what's inside of it currently. So context dot give me 1 second here. Context dot, where is it? I want to get my child content. Ugh. I need to get that child content somewhere else. Let me grab it up here. Right, so I'm going to get the stuff that's already in there, right? It's not inside context. That's how I get to my attributes. So this is collection of items. I believe I need to pull it out of output. I want to get, let me get the child content, which means I need to make this. Yeah, that's gonna go over real well. Cool. So that should be a tag helper content. I actually want to get that content. Okay, that should be a string. Good. So I'm going to append the HTML of child content. Let's see if that actually worked. Plenty of time. Plenty of time. So I'll go over to about. There we go. Wishful thinking for our friends from Chicago. Anybody from Cleveland? To my friends in Ohio, good luck to you too. All right. So that's a little bit about tag helpers. Now there's another thing that we have available also called a view component. Okay? Now a view component, unlike a tag helper where it's all C# code, a view component actually has a view CSHTML file on disk that you can change, make fit however your application needs, and it has a C# component that you can write and work with as well. So what I'm going to do, I've actually already got another project that does that. So I'm going to open that, and it is view component demo. So for this, I created an object called a trip that has a destination. It's a very complex model, as you can tell. I wrote a trip repository that has a simple in-memory list of locations that I'd like to go to. We like the second location there a little bit more than some of the others. I'm from Philadelphia. And then just a method to go return those things, okay? You may actually have a repository object that goes and interacts with a SQL Server database, a Mongo database, some other database, and you have this facade that you can interact with. A view component is a class that inherits from the view component class. That sounds weird. It inherits from the view component base class. That's better. And it implements the invoke async method, all right? So from this method, it's actually structured and looks like a normal controller action method. It's returning an asynchronous task of, and this doesn't look goofy at all, view component result. View component result. Right. So this is a view for a view component, okay? So very simply, view components, like my other objects that are created by the framework, are passed objects through dependency injection. We saw how to configure that earlier. So I'm receiving my trip repository into this. I stash it in my local property. And then down here, I get that list of trips. I'm doing an await just because it doesn't need to run asynchronously. My repository probably should function asynchronously if I'm waiting for SQL Server or Azure SQL or some distant network connection to happen to deliver my content. But since it's in memory, I'm faking it out here. And then return view trips, right? I'm used to seeing that type of syntax in my controllers, but where is my view? This isn't a controller, so it's not going to live in my views folder underneath the name of my controller. It actually lives, it can live there, but it lives in a components child folder with trip next to that, right? Because that's the name of my view component. And then because I didn't name my view, it's returning default CSHTML, right? That's the one by default that it's going to reference and use. So let's zoom out here and run this. Let's see what this looks like. Okay, so I have it, I believe it's on my About page on this one. There we go. So it's listing my list of trips. How do I call that on the About page? You do an @await because it's asynchronously running, and I specify the name of the view component. It finds it in my project and executes it and puts the content right there. Simple. But you have a bit more flexibility now to write more complex C# code and update your view and do cool things with your view over here, just like you would if you were building a controller with views. So a little bit more flexibility. It actually feels a little bit like a user control, an ASCX file in web forms. I don't see anybody cringing at the thought of web forms, so that couldn't be that bad an analogy. Okay, I even got a thumbs up over here. Thank you, sir. All right. So that's another way that you can work with your user interface. So we've done a lot with user interface. Let's take away the user interface now and talk about Web API. So I'm going to create a new project. This time I'm going to choose the Web API template. Web API controllers and MVC controllers were merged, okay? You might have been like me where we had an MVC controller class, right? Just a controller for how many years, and I knew what that was, and I was phenomenal at working with those and returning JSON or other formats besides HTML. And then Web API came along, and I have an API controller, and it has a different security model. And it's not the same as a controller, but I inherit and build things in it just like I did in MVC, but I've got to use those magic HTTP verb function names, right? Method names like get, post, and put. So we came to a conclusion, you know what, let's reduce some of that confusion and make one controller object. And that's what we have now. If you look over here, we have controllers, and the default controller we give you is values controller. It's decorated with a route that says this is an API, so we're going to navigate to API/controller, right? There's that template I was showing you earlier. The name of the controller, in this case values, is dumped right there in the route. Just like we had before with Web API, I've got the option to decorate each one of my action methods with the name of the HTTP verb as an attribute that I want to interact with. So get, post, put, delete, simple, right? You're kind of used to seeing this if you've done Web API in the past. Now, what's also interesting about this is I'm always returning, right? I'm returning just a standard object here. We've actually built something with Web API it's like duck typing. We know that this is called a values controller. I actually don't need to inherit from controller because you're telling me it's a controller in the name of it. So if I run this, so it's navigating to /API/values, and it returns my two values, and it's formatted because as JSON right here for me. So you have this this duck typing around your controllers, okay? Because they're returning and they're interacting with standard CLR types, okay? When you start working with the MVC stuff and you need to reference the base methods like view, right? And you're returning action results, you need to inherit from controller to make some of that stuff happen. Now, there are ways to reduce the overhead of your API project. And I'm running really late on time, so I think I'm going to need to pass on that. What I will tell you is this project brings in MVC, routing, and these other things right off the top. If you look at what MVC includes, I'm in a web API only project, and I'm referencing razor and tag helpers and view features. You can actually reference a package called MVC.core, right? Microsoft ASP.NET Core.mvc.core, and it'll drop out some of these other things that you don't need if you're not dealing with views, and you can focus on API. All right, there's some options there that you can work with. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, I'll put it in the notes, the show notes, about how to do that stuff, how to work with just the API and the MVC core project. So let me back up. Let me go back to the other project that we were working on, 90, and let's put this in a Docker container. Real easy to do with the new tools that we have. You can see Docker for Windows down here. This is running with Linux containers. I'm sharing my C drive. I've allocated 2 CPUs to it. When you install the Docker extension in Visual Studio, so you have to install the Docker tools from www.docker.com, but, wrong one. If you reference the, let me look at the installed. If you include the Visual Studio 2015 tools for Docker, you can actually right-click on your project and choose to add Docker support, and it generates all the files you need to build and debug this on Linux from Visual Studio, right? Because this is a .NET Core. So and it also adds, it adds Docker as a startup possibility. So if I click on that, it's going to build, and then it's going to run through all the steps it needs to compose and build my application, and then stick it inside that Docker container with the debugger attached. Okay? So now it's listening as we try to navigate to it. Docker's become a really big story for us at Microsoft. We see this as a way for you to virtualize and build your applications in a way that's very maintainable, but at the same time, you as a developer can build your application and put it into a container on your desktop and then send it over to your friends in operations, and they can put it down in the cloud, and it just works. He needs this one for a birdie. It's looking good. It might respond. Argument null happened in Entity Core. Oh, Entity Framework Core. So sorry, there's no SQL Server on Linux. So actually, did you see that? It was booting up in Linux, and it errored out here, and I've got a stack trace from Linux because it was trying to find a SQL Server on the Linux application, okay? So you actually, instead of using SQL Server, you need to use another database that is present in a container or somewhere that it can reach to. Now, my SQL Server configuration was actually trying to run locally with local DB. That doesn't exist on Linux. So it failed, and I got a great, actually, error stack trace here that shows me that, yeah, I failed because there is no SQL Server. So that's actually pretty cool. It didn't work, but it actually showed some other features around debugging a little bit better than I was going to show you. So thank you, Visual Studio. So that's a little bit about Docker and how easy it is to get it up and running. Once you have an image that's running, you can actually publish your image so that your other folks in your company, your friends, can download and use that image on their machines as well. if I want to publish to Azure, right? I want to publish to the cloud. I right-click, choose Publish, and I can choose App Service. And it's going to give me some places that I can put it here because I've already got some resources out there. I'm going to put it over here in my DN community. Let's put it on this. And you know what? Let's create a new one. So we'll call this DEVintersection MVC demo. Sure, that's fine. That's fine. Go. And it's going to create that space out there on Azure and deploy it for me. And I'm playing with fire, thinking I can get that to happen in less than a minute or two. Over the Wi-Fi, nothing but net. Ooh, maybe. Here it comes, publishing it, writing it all out. We've actually done a lot to speed up this deployment so that it's very fast, and we can help you get your content onto Azure as fast as possible. There it is doing my build, it's doing my post-publish steps, sending it out to Azure. See, I put this at the end because it's so fast, so good. And I'm going to be made to eat my words here by the demo gods, I know it. Here it comes, come on, no whammies, no whammies. I've got a full green bar, that must mean it's done. There it is, it's doing IIS MS deploy. It's pushing it out. And, come on. I'll give it just a little bit longer. I think I'm playing with fire here because I'm doing this over the Wi-Fi. There are now, on the app service, we do have a preview. App service typically is a Windows server when you publish to it, but we do now have a preview that will allow you to publish to a Linux server on the app service. That's a special one that you have to set up, and then you configure just a little bit differently here in the UI, and it'll be available to you. Oh man, come on, tell me, go Azure. It's your birthday. Show me that website. It might happen. I bet you it's going to blow up because of that SQL Server thing again. Nope. Because the SQL Server's not there. Because I don't have a local DB. But it published and I got the white screen because there's no error handler because I'm in production. Ha-ha. So it is there. I promise it's there. But there's no local DB on that box. Bummer that I didn't get to see that, but that's what I get for publishing one that has a database without configuring it. Let me show you those links as we wrap up here because I'm just a second or two over. All the places that you can get .NET, get the docs, follow our source code. People are getting involved with the source code, even if they're just watching repositories of things that you're interested in so that you know when things change. There's an announcements repository under /ASP.NET that if you go there and watch that, whenever a breaking change in some new feature is made, they put an entry in the announcements repository and you'll receive an email, okay? There's like 18,000 people watching that repository. So check it out. If you want to be on the bleeding edge and maybe contribute, check out the announcements repository. Community stand-up every Tuesday at live ASP.NET. Our blog, blogsmsdnmicrosoft.com/webdev. And we just released the preview 1 of 1.1. I'm a little bit over, but my name is Jeff Fritz. Thank you so much for coming. Tweet me. I'll be more than happy to respond to you.